The ideal function for the Wizard's Council is the generation of those that can be easily fooled, especially those who are fooled by themselves, such as the mystery about the girl who, having a baby, tries to hush the crying infant to sleep so that it can stop extorting from her. And the moment that it goes to sleep, she then immediately asks the question, what is it thinking? What is it doing? The action of going from one extreme to the other extreme, creating the function of the pendulum, which is fundamental to the existence of the structure, such as the continuation of the pains of birth immediately changed by the extreme chemical emotions derived by after the birth, generates the polar opposites. To this extent, this makes them the best function of conduits of magic by virtue of the extremes of their opposites, and thus the targets for extortions, for the creation of pendulums, and thus the use of magic is fundamentally feminine. Thus, in this mechanism, you generate the capacity for the pendulum to go in both directions, and for the wizards to engage in missing the pendulum's swing so that it does not get hit whenever it goes into its extreme opposites, as the funnel of the magic is being distracted by the extreme opposites, and to this extent generates the perpetual energy machine from their scams, and thus the mechanism under their religion states that anyone who can be scammed is immoral to not scam, and thus the hyper-acceleration towards this requires the immediate capture of women as an inferior entity and not to be considered an actual person, beyond the function of using them as a tool, and thus you have the mechanism to generate the female Gnostics, who are fundamentally both opposed to and attracted to the rapists, who they are fundamentally reliant on for the entirety of their self-worth. And to this end you generate the perpetuation of the witchcraft by the system of the leading druids. And in this, you engage in the 80-20 rule. 80% of the work is done by 20% of the workers, and the 20% of the workers are then extorted for the 20%, and thus 80% of the work's profit is then derivative exclusively to the wizards, and thus the dividing of the theft of the 20%, leaving the rest of the 80% to the rest of them, to the higher earners and to the lower earners. You have the mechanism of the 20%, which is then sold to everyone who is willing to be scammed. And instead of consuming amongst the whole and finding their place amongst the organism, they promote themselves under the 20%. And thus it is fundamental that the scam artists exist and be promoted, as they are fundamental to these societies, which are systemically taking over the system. At which point, as a parasite, the body is replaced with the imposter and generates a new body, similar to in Final Fantasy VII, the creation of Sephiroth's plan. Manufacture the engagement of the consumption of the entire world as a world parasite, and then moves on using the former world, which has been crushed and crumbled and consumed, into the next meteor to be cast upon as a magic specifically tailored towards the new world, and the new world, and the new world, etc., 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 until it ceases to stop. And to this extent, you have the mechanism of perpetual consumption of itself until the capability of creation has been negated by the consumption, and thus the action of atrophy creates the death of the whole. And with the death of the entire mechanism of the cosmos not being able to create more, you then have the death of the entire ability to have created any of the dreams. And thus you have complete and total death. You have the second death, not just the death of the mechanisms, but the death of the creation of mechanisms. And so by woman, life is created, and thus by woman, life is killed. Take, for instance, the assertion of the Wizards' Council taking their 20% of the whole. The deal with the devil derives the powers for the Wizards' Council, which then has to betray itself in order to sustain itself, as the perpetuation of the parasites requires the existence of the purest form by which to sacrifice in the future. And as the thing to be consumed for the devil that provided them the advantage, they then betray one of their own. As they are scam artists, the act of betrayal is fundamental to their existence, and thus the whole, who is presumed the consumer of the entirety of good, becomes to himself exclusively good, and the exclusively good betrayed by the rest of the Wizards' Council is then set up systemically to create a system of him choosing in order to stabilize the benefits of the stolen goods, or to the stabilizing of the existence of the organism by which the creation of those goods are created, and thus choosing the most extraordinarily rare option. He might not kill the goose that kills the golden eggs, and thus the goose that lays the golden eggs can perpetuate the existence of the life by virtue of the hard choices specifically chosen by the good wizard, who would not have done so if he had been able to acquire the position of the Wizard Council. So, if he cannot acquire the position of the Wizard's Council because he is too good, then by definition, he isn't on the Wizard's Council. But if he is trickable, if he is the sacrificial party for Frezzo, then he will be a part of the Wizard Council, and he will be the consumption of the illusion of good, and he will fail the tests, which then destroys the system, creating the perceived collapse, ending the free ride of the stolen goods. Take, for instance, how many times can a route be robbed by pirates and it not used anymore? How many times does that has to happen before the increase of the security happens, ending the free ride? At which point the question becomes, can the raiders defeat the defenders? Creates the exponential increase of the cost of business, which subverts the entire point of conducting the magic for the Wizard Council, at which point you have the ending of the free ride. And their entire point is to conduct a grift for free resources that they could not otherwise earn. To this extent, you understand that the mechanism of the rituals requires the non-violent variant of the system so that they can continue to receive the free rides, which can only exist if the parties give the property willingly, and thus are scammed, and thus the existence of the party having forfeited the thing without the threats of violence, then you have the perpetuation of the free ride as long as there's a new mark in order to grift. So, to this extent, you understand that the mechanism, such as in the secret records position of the vaulted original story for the Wish movie, creates the function of Magnifico, who is the consolidation of the good wizard who has been betrayed by his wizard's council. And the irony is that he's entirely not suspicious enough to investigate the proper solution, and the only way for him to have survived and not been consumed under the trap so that he can be devoured creates the position that he would have to be a counterinsurgent from the beginning, loyal to the good, outside of the function of the benefit which the scam artist would be conducting, which, by definition, comes at the risk that he might not be elected the consumer of the good, and thus would have to do one of the other roles if he was not one chosen for the predetermined position, which is entirely out of his hands, and thus you understand the problem inherent for risking such an extraordinary venture. But this would, by definition, explain his being allergic to competitive magic, as the function of the Wizards Council requires the scrutiny in order to engage in the proper defenses against the various threats which he fundamentally understands how to do. And to that extent, you understand that he is, in the one case, perceived as too cautious, which is an illusion derived by the demon lord seeking to eat him, so that he will not become cautious enough in order to have succeeded and passed the test and done the extraordinary and saved the goose that lays the golden egg, sustaining the actual infinite prosperity he so fundamentally desires. And since the tricks then become the function of disguising the thing that you want as the thing that you don't want, they then run away from the thing that they like in favor of the trap that they are running away from. Take, for instance, the function of the reduction of art fundamentally derived by the uncreative. The uncreative then have to dumb down the collective art in order for you to avoid it. But then, by definition, you do not have the material components derived by that art in the general society in order to have sustained the necessary actions to produce what you needed for the restarting of the artistic will. And to this end, they generate the distraction with its negative, and thus the tricking of the party of avoiding the product by virtue of the pursuit of its negative creates the function allowing for the permanent state, which then collapses into the perfect negative which they were running away from, as they have collapsed into the action. So you understand that the specific function, let's take it an 80-20 rule. The party wants to sustain the 80%, and so the party avoids the 20%, which is necessary to continue the function in perpetuity. And thus he must abandon the 80%, which makes them nervous, which fundamentally the Wizards Council would have created the entire spell to sustain the 80%, so they would have to abandon their original purpose, in order to pursue the 20%, and amongst the 20%, you would have to find the 1% of the 20% in order to continue that mechanism. At which point, the function of ignoring the entire purpose of the spell is the only way to have found the mechanism of rejuvenation. And to this extent, it being the rarest thing, has to accept the potential of the collapse of the collective goods in order to sustain the reproduction, and thus the continuation in perpetuity of the thing requires the abandoning of the spell in order to do this. And thus, in the action, the party becomes deceived into destroying that rejuvenation from the mechanisms which are hyper-exaggerated by the devil that gave them the deal in the first place. And to that end, it becomes a self-fulfilled conclusion that the parties then destroy the whole for the enemy of the whole that promised them a sliver in perpetuity if they gave them the capacity to murder the thing that they were designed under the scam to betray. Take, for instance, the stories of Beauty and the Beast or The Princess and the Frog. The mechanism is the engrossing into the extraordinary thing by which is designed to be abandoned in order to acquire the good pursued generically by the witch in question. And the function is the witch, which is a woman who has been converted into the function of the sorcery so that they can receive their Disney magic, is then entranced and intoxicated into the function, but then must pursue past the point of repulsion in order to reach the benefits of the rejuvenation, which is in itself the most extraordinary subversion of the devil, which has put as many obstacles as possible in order to make them reject the rejuvenation and cease the perpetuation of the narrative and the cost of business generating the position of the subversion of the scam which they are receiving the benefits from. In this case, you have to ignore the benefits of the magic in order to rejuvenate the magic. And the princesses who fail this function are then chosen for the collapse of that function, turning it into a shell of its former company, generating the end of the creation of the wealth so that they might collapse into abject misery as they become the butt of the joke for the next generation who may choose from the deal with the devil scam to not reject the function of rejuvenation in favor of holding on to the majority which they have hoarded for themselves. And the devil, knowing this, needs the function of the witch to have collapsed into herself and then to have chosen the journey of her own destruction in the pursuit of the thing that she scammed for, and thus the mechanism of her pursuit of it, of the very reason she got entranced by the magic. She has rejected the creation of magic for the pursuit of magic, and thus has condemned herself to the route and the destiny of her own death, facilitating her being consumed by the devil who has given her the magic in the first place, so that she may be devoured. And each step that she takes in favor of this destiny becomes exponentially more burdensome and hard than the previous step, as each is a trap which requires more energy to go up than it does to go down. and to that end her escaping her destiny becomes the least likely, and thus it is consumed to its own definition of being destiny, or a most negative reproduction of the infinite reduction by her own malchoices, in order to be the least likely for her to abandon the function of her death in favor of her rejuvenation, which becomes the function of the trap for each of the devils which has set the witches on the path, so that they may destroy their own and collapse the entirety of the ecosystem by virtue of ceasing to rejuvenate the function or accepting the process of rejuvenation for the whole of the people instead of the whole of the magic, which has hoarded the value, which is simply protecting the function of the additional feast for the devil that will consume it when it eats the witch that was trying to protect it. All she has done is defended the mechanism that she does not want to be consumed so that it can be consumed by the predetermined party which has given her access to the scam. So if they ascend past the function of magician and accumulate themselves into the embodiment of nature, then they themselves do not care except for the extraordinary specific action of rejuvenation, and to the act of becoming rejuvenation itself have become nature, and the action under the magician's function which has pursued themselves in order to become like God must become the nature of God, and thus the laws of nature must be consumed as their entirety as they abandon ego in favor of the rejuvenation, which is the only true mechanism. And once they have accepted the laws of God to become the laws of nature, they abandon the ego, which would then become like God, and thus the action of renouncing the sin which has stained the human race, according to the magician's study of the knowledge of good and evil, that they can become like God. They, having been masters of nature and nature's law, have been created by God to enforce nature's law, and the acceptance of this position without the entanglements of their ego is the only way for them to have sustained this position of rejuvenation and not condemn themselves to the fated death. And in the action of not fating themselves to death, have completely abandoned the function of ego, which has asserted themselves equal or challenger or rival to God, and thus the forfeiting of all ambition is the only mechanism of sustaining themselves. And then the function of Lucifer engaging under their religious texts, becoming equal with God, or pursuing the function of becoming equal with God, then creates this delusion which has then created his collapse, which then pursues the function of the alternative without the capacity of rejuvenation, which requires the perpetual function of theft as a parasite, which has become the trap of the devils, which they cannot escape from while they keep their identity as devils. And the function requires them to have abandoned their identity as devils in order to escape the plague, but they have been subject to the rituals of their own devices, which has created the self delusion which has created their imprisonment. similar to the function which has been expressed in the prison industrial industry, which has created a position where guards cannot speak fundamentally with the prisoners. They must engage in the derivative function of simply engaging in an aggression, and thus the function of abuse, and thus the conversion of many of the negative wizards in the creation and reproduction of domestic abusers, as the taint from the ritual forces them to bring it home, as they are still themselves and they carry it with them everywhere they go, as it is a fundamental aspect of their career. It becomes carried as a part of their soul, which is the function of them laundering the evils as they become the patsy, as they become the trash can to consume the negative karma, derivative of the wizards who created the prison industrial complex, so that another can take the negative karma and they can escape with the goods. Thus, the function of the trap of the devil has tainted themselves with this identity, which has then forced themselves into the position that they cannot escape without abandoning their very identity, which they cannot do.